In the book of Esther, all of the Jews in Persia had been sentenced to death by a man named Haman. But after Queen Esther stepped up and put her life on the line, Haman was exposed as the enemy and sentenced to death himself. But even though he's out of the picture, his death sentence against the Jews is still in place. And even after they wrote a neutralizing decree that allowed for the Jews to defend themselves, there was still a battle that was going to happen. So in this episode of the Following Jesus podcast, we're going to see how the book of Esther ends and what happens on this awaited day. Hi, my name is David Cipriano. I'm a youth pastor and my goal is to teach the Bible to as many people as possible. This is week number 11 of our study through the book of Esther, and this is the last episode of the series. So we're going to be looking at chapters 9 and 10 and seeing how the story of Esther ends. And there's three main things that we're going to look at. First is the fight. Here's how Esther 9 starts. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. So chapter 9 starts on the 13th day of the 12th month, and this was the awaited day that Haman had chosen for the genocide of the Jews. And you probably know by now, but God's name isn't found one single time in the book of Esther. And it seems strange that there would be a book of the Bible that never once has the name of God in it. And to the people that were in the story, it probably seemed at times like he wasn't there, but God's evidence is found all over the book. And God is just as much in control when you can see him versus when you can't see him. And even when you can't see his name, you can always see his hand. And just because God seems silent, it doesn't mean that he's absent. And we even see one of these evidences in the day which Haman chose. Let me explain. So back in chapter 3, Haman had cast Purim to determine when it was to kill the Jews. This would have been like rolling the dice or flipping a coin. So he cast lots in the first month, and the lots came up 12, the latest possible month. And I believe that this wasn't just good luck, but it was God's providence, because it gave God and his people as much time as possible to overcome the odds. Now I realize that God could have saved his people no matter how much time he had, but I think that we see an evidence of God here, and even though it seemed like random chance when this date was, I think that God's hand was still there. So on the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew was to be killed. But in between chapters 3 and 9, the tables had been turned. Haman's dead, he's been executed, Mordecai has taken his place, and Haman's decree has been neutralized, but there's still going to be an inevitable battle. And in verse 1, it says the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them. People were still planning on killing the Jews. And maybe you're wondering to yourself, why would anybody fight the Jews? Why did they see that this battle was necessary? And I think that the reason here is very clear, and the reason was hatred and oppression. Anti-Semitism is nothing new. People have been against the people of God for a very long time, and this was about more than just getting back at Mordecai for not bowing to Haman. No, this genocide of the Jewish people was about racism, it was about hatred, and even with their biggest enemy gone, there were still very many people who wanted to kill God's people. So on that anticipated day, the Jews and their enemies were going to fight this inevitable battle. It says the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. So we see a few things about this battle. First is the Jews' dominance. Now remember, the Jews were not the aggressors in this battle. They were simply defending themselves, and they were extremely dominant that day. They had their way with their enemies. It says no man could withstand them. The Jews smote all their enemies. And yet, in spite of the Jews' dominance, they still had a lot of enemies that they didn't have enough time to fight and kill in the first day. So Esther goes to the king again, and she asks him for a second day of the battle to finish the job, which the king agrees to. And I'm not really sure why anybody was still challenging them on the second day. I mean, you think that they should have learned their lesson after the first day when the Jews killed all of their enemies, and yet people were still wanting to fight the Jews. And over the course of these 2 days of battle, the Jews killed 800 men in the capital city of Shushan. And that sounds like a lot, because it is, but that's only a small part of what was happening in the entire nation of Persia. Because verse 16 says, "But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and had rest from their enemies and slew of their foes 75,000. The Jews had a lot of enemies and a lot of people who wanted them dead. And it's obvious here that God gave them the victory. There is no way that these Jews, who were just a small minority group in the world's most powerful empire, could have accomplished all on their own. They could not have done it without God's help. And this dominance in battle was yet another evidence that the Jewish people were the people of God. They were God's chosen people. So we see first their dominance, and next we see their help. We see that the Jews found some unlikely support. In verse 3 it says, "And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them." So we see that people ended up helping them who were originally going to hurt them. God used people who were going to be their enemies to help save them. And this is a reminder to us, God can change the most unlikely people. I mean, sometimes we look at people and we think God could never save them. They could never believe the gospel. They could never change. They'll never be anything different. But let me remind you that no matter how evil a person may seem, they're still a person that God can use. God can still change that heart. Nobody is too lost for God to save, because God can change people's hearts. And we see that here, because these people who probably would have been killing the Jews on that day, now they're fighting for the Jews. So we see their dominance and their help. Next we see their display. They make a display out of their enemies. The 10 sons of Haman the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. So even though their father had been killed in this cause, Haman's 10 sons still fought in the battle. And because the Jews were so dominant against their enemies, the Jews killed the 10 sons of Haman. And it appears that Haman had taught his sons to hate the Jews. And even though Haman had died and there had been a new decree, his sons were still fighting against the Jews. And it looks like this hatred and prejudice was really deep and ingrained. And when the Jews kill the sons of Haman, they make a special display out of them. In verses 13 and 14 it says, "Then said Esther, If it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." And the king commanded it so to be done. And the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. So these sons had already been killed, but now they're making an example out of these people. They hang them on the gallows. This was a message to the world that said, this is what happens when you go against the people of God. And it kind of reminds me of how when David defeated Goliath, he cut off his head. And he cut off his head after he was already dead. And when he does this, I don't think that it was just about making sure Goliath was dead. No, it was about making a display out of an enemy of God. This is what happens when you fight against God and against God's people. And this is what the Jewish people do with Haman's sons. They make a public display out of them. This is what happens when you go against the Jews. Now this next part of the battle that we see might seem to contradict the last one, but it actually doesn't when you really think about it, and it's the mercy of the Jews. So while they made a display of the ones who they killed, they showed mercy to the ones who were still alive. In verses 15 and 16 it says this, "For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 70 and 5,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey." So when the Jews were defeating their enemies in battle, taking the spoils was their legal right. It had been included in this decree that they could take the spoils, but they chose not to do it. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. And I'm not trying to say that it's always wrong to take spoils, and we often see God's people doing that, but the Jews chose not to do that here, because the Jews weren't just trying to seek revenge, or to get ahead, or to even the score. No, they were just simply defending themselves. The Jews were not the aggressors in the war, they were just doing self-defense. And in their self-defense, they showed mercy to the people who were still alive. And they show this mercy by not taking the spoils. God has called us to be merciful. Jesus said in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." You see, as Christians, we should show mercy because we've been shown the greatest mercy. When God saved us, He showed us mercy. And because of God's mercy that He's given to us, we should give that mercy to other people. We don't deserve for God to withhold punishment from us, and yet He does. So that means that when people wrong us, we should show them mercy. And that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be accountable. It doesn't mean that there should be no justice for wrongdoings. But in general, we should be showing mercy because God has shown mercy to us. And this is what the Jews do to the Persians. Even though they did fight back, and even though they did kill their enemies, they showed mercy in the fact that they didn't take the spoils. They weren't trying to be opportunists. And because of what happened in this inevitable battle, and because of how God saved them, we see the second thing of the story, and that's the Feast of Purim. And today, the Feast of Purim is something that the Jews will still celebrate. And this annual tradition is something that started right here in the book of Esther. Verses 17 and 18 say, "On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same, rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness." So after the Jews win the battle, they celebrate and hold the first ever Feast of Purim. So they invented a new holiday. Some people say that we shouldn't celebrate holidays like Easter or Christmas because they're not in the Bible. And it's true that those holidays aren't specifically commanded or shown in the Bible, but we see here in Esther that the followers of God had invented a new holiday that hadn't been kept before. The Feast of Purim wasn't commanded by God, it was the people's own initiative. So when people say that we shouldn't keep a certain holiday because God didn't command us to do it in the Bible, this is a bad argument. The argument goes against biblical principle. And if you're talking to a person who's anti-holidays, then show them this story, because it's not wrong to keep holidays that weren't specifically commanded by God. In fact, it's even honoring to God when we have these traditions that bring glory to Him. Hey, there's nothing wrong with new traditions, new celebrations, new holidays. And we see this in the story of Esther, because they invent this new holiday because they want to remember what God has done. And when it comes to the Feast of Purim, let's notice three things about this inaugural event. First is that they rested. I imagine that ever since the decree went out to kill all of the Jews would have had a lot of anxiety and unrest and stress and fear. This would have been a really difficult period of time for them. This would have been a really hard year. But after the victory has been won and their enemies have been defeated, they can finally rest. And it reminds me of Exodus 33:14, where God says says, "My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest." And after what would have seemed like an eternity of stress and anxiety, the battle is finally over. The Jews can finally rest. And we also see that they celebrated. But the Jews that were in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. So it shows that after God had spared his people, they celebrated. And these verses say that they had feasting and gladness and a good day. The Jews celebrated what God did. And I think that it's a shame when Christians today don't want to praise God. Sometimes we don't want to sing about our salvation and worship God for his love. Sometimes we can't think of anything that we're thankful for. And sometimes we go an entire day without thinking about what God has done for us. And this is a shame when it happens, because we should be celebrating God. We should be worshiping and praising God. And this is what the Jews do here, because after God had spared them, they celebrated. After anticipating their death and their genocide, they've just experienced an overwhelming victory. And at the feast, they praise God. And third, we see that they remembered. They remembered what God had done. You see, this feast and celebration, it's the first of an annual tradition that's still going on today. The Jews still keep the Feast of Purim, and we see their remembrance in the following verses. "And Mordecai wrote these things, and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, in the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor." So we see here that the Jews were observing the first ever Feast of Purim, and the Jews still celebrate this feast today, similar to how Christians might celebrate Christmas or Easter. And the Feast of Purim is where the Jews commemorate the time in their history when Haman, the Jews' enemy, wrote a decree to have them killed, and how he cast lots to determine what day to kill them on. But Esther went to the king, this changed their fate, and Haman was hanged on his own gallows that he had met for Mordecai, and his sons were hanged too. And the Jewish people were saved from Haman and from all their enemies, and to this day they still haven't forgotten how they were saved. The Jews have a tradition of remembering, and I think that one of the biggest reasons why people drift away from God is because they've forgotten what God's done for them in their lives. Maybe it's taking their salvation for granted. Maybe it's not recognizing God as the giver of every good gift. Maybe they're thinking that they're self-made instead of God-made. See, we backslide and we rebel because we've ignored God. We've forgotten what God's done. And this is why things like holidays and traditions are so helpful. It's because they help us remember what God's done. And this is why Mordecai decided to make this annual feast, because he didn't want for his people to ever forget what God did. At the Feast of Purim, the people remembered God. So in these final chapters, we see number 1, the fight, number 2, the Feast of Purim, and number 3, we see the final words. The last verse in the book of Esther says this: "For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed." Mordecai and Haman had switched places. Now, I don't believe in karma. I don't believe that your actions determine your life in a future existence where you can reincarnate as an animal or as a more privileged person depending on your decisions today. I don't believe in that. That's not a biblical principle, but I do believe in the law of reaping and sowing, because the Bible says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." So while I don't believe in the religious teaching of karma, I do recognize that God rewards the righteous and he punishes the wicked. And we see this in the story of Esther, because Haman and Mordecai both reaped what they sowed. Haman, because of his wickedness, ended up reaping punishment, shame, and death. But Mordecai, because of his righteousness and faithfulness, he reaped honor and reward and promotion. You see, in this rivalry between Haman and Mordecai, God was always in control. And that's really what the book of Esther is about, because ultimately, Esther is not a book about Esther or Mordecai or Haman or King Ahasuerus. No, Esther is a story about God and his providence. It's a story of how God saved his people from death. And no matter how inevitable it seemed, God always had a sovereign plan, even if the people didn't always see it at the time. And this story teaches us that even when you can't see God, he's always there. Whether God's out in front and obvious, or whether God's behind the scenes working the details together, God is always directing and always guiding. And even when things may look like a mess, God's still in control. So that concludes our study through the book of Esther. I hope that this study was a help and a blessing to you. And on next Monday, we're starting a new series going through the book of James. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Following Jesus podcast, and make sure to subscribe for more biblical teaching like this.